I think they're from the same source. I mean, I really do. I don't see, I see it's all on a continuum. You know what I mean? It's just a form of expression.
Cillian Murphy has spent nearly 3 decades convincing audiences that he is someone they should be afraid of. He has played gangsters, assassins, scientists, villains, soldiers, and men carrying enough darkness inside them to destroy everything around them. Yet outside the frame, Murphy has built almost the exact opposite kind of life. No constant social media updates. No obsession with celebrity culture. No habit of turning his private relationships into entertainment. And perhaps most surprisingly, the woman who has been beside him through nearly every major chapter of his career has remained almost completely outside the spotlight. Yvonne McGuinness knew Murphy before Thomas Shelby made him famous, before Christopher Nolan trusted him with Oppenheimer, and long before an Oscar ended up in his hands. That makes their story different from the usual Hollywood romance. There was no carefully manufactured celebrity couple image. Instead, there was a relationship that grew while Murphy was still trying to figure out what his life would become. And now, after his return as Tommy Shelby, the contrast is even more fascinating. The world keeps asking to see more of Cillian Murphy. He keeps giving them almost nothing. And that silence has a story behind it. Long before Murphy became one of cinema's most recognizable faces, he was simply a young man from Cork who wasn't even sure acting would become his future. In the 1990s, his biggest creative ambition was music. He played in a rock band with friends, performing in the kind of venues where nobody was thinking about movie premieres or awards ceremonies. They were young, energetic, and convinced that the band might become something. It didn't. But something far more important happened during that period. Murphy began discovering that performing in front of people felt strangely natural to him. He didn't have the crippling stage fear many performers describe. Instead, he enjoyed the uncertainty of it. Every show could go differently. Every audience could react differently. That instinct eventually pushed him toward theater, where the stakes were even higher because there was no second take. At the time, nothing about his life looked like the beginning of a global acting career. There was no Hollywood machine behind him, and no guarantee that anyone outside Cork would ever know his name. He was simply experimenting with the future. But one decision was about to change everything. The irony is that Murphy's early music career failed in exactly the way many teenage bands fail. The songs didn't become hits. The group didn't turn into the next major Irish rock act. Eventually, that chapter faded away. But the people and experiences surrounding it stayed with him. Murphy has often spoken warmly about those early years because they represented something he would later struggle to find again: freedom. He wasn't being photographed for magazines. Nobody cared what he wore. Nobody was analyzing his accent or asking what his next film would be. He was just a young musician performing with friends. During this period, he met Yvonne McGuinness, an art student who would eventually become his wife. Their relationship began before Murphy had anything resembling celebrity status, which matters because she didn't fall for a movie star. There wasn't one. She knew the person underneath the ambition, before the intense preparation, the red carpets, and the endless questions about his private life. As Murphy moved toward acting, she remained part of that journey, rather than becoming a character in it. The band disappeared. Acting took over. But the relationship survived the transition. And that was only the beginning. Murphy's relationship with Yvonne began at a time when neither could have predicted where his career would eventually go. He was still a young performer in Cork, while Yvonne was developing her own path as an artist. Their lives were nowhere near the world of Hollywood. There were no million-dollar contracts or international premieres to complicate things. They were simply two young people figuring themselves out. That foundation would become incredibly important later. When Murphy's career started accelerating, he already had someone who knew what he was like when nobody was watching. Their connection wasn't created by fame. Fame arrived afterward. That distinction may explain why Murphy has been so protective of their relationship. Yvonne never needed to become a celebrity herself to remain important to his story. She continued developing her own artistic career, while Murphy moved deeper into acting. In the years that followed, he would travel for productions, disappear into demanding characters, and spend months surrounded by people whose entire job was to create the next big movie. Yet the relationship remained remarkably separate from that machinery. There was no obvious attempt to turn it into publicity, no constant interviews about their romance, no carefully planned public image. For Murphy, that separation seems to have been intentional. But before the privacy became part of his identity, another role changed his entire future. In 1996, Murphy stepped onto the stage in Disco Pigs, and suddenly the experiment became something much more serious. He was only 20 years old, and the production was far removed from the polished world audiences would later associate with him. It was raw, physical, unpredictable theater. The kind of performance where something could go wrong at any second, and the actors had to keep moving. Murphy has remembered those early theater years with unusual affection, because they taught him something that no film set could completely reproduce: how to stay alive inside a moment. There were distractions. There were unpredictable audience reactions. There were moments when the environment itself threatened to interfere with the performance. Instead of treating that uncertainty as a problem, Murphy learned to use it. The experience helped establish the acting philosophy that would eventually become one of his trademarks. Don't force everything. Don't make every emotion obvious. Let the character breathe. Let silence do some of the work. That approach would later become incredibly effective when he played characters who rarely explained themselves. But at the time, he was still a young Cork actor trying to understand where this new path might lead. He couldn't have known that the tiny theater where his professional career began would eventually lead him to Christopher Nolan, Thomas Shelby, and an Oscar. And the relationship he was building away from the stage would follow him through all of it. There was a point when Cillian Murphy could have taken a completely different road. Before acting became his profession, he had been studying law, but the pull toward performance became impossible to ignore. Theater offered something his academic path couldn't: uncertainty, adrenaline, and the feeling that anything could happen once the lights came up. For someone who had already discovered how comfortable he was in front of an audience, that freedom became addictive. Choosing acting wasn't exactly the safe decision. There was no guarantee he would become successful, and the entertainment industry was filled with talented people who never got their big break. But Murphy took the risk anyway. That decision eventually changed everything about his life, from where he lived to the people he met, and the characters he would eventually become famous for. If you're enjoying this deeper look into the man behind the roles, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the story gets even more interesting from here. Murphy wasn't simply choosing a career. He was choosing a life that would eventually place him in rooms he had never imagined entering. But there was one person who remained beside him as that transformation began. What makes Murphy and Yvonne's relationship particularly unusual is the timeline. Their connection began before the actor had any reason to believe fame was waiting for him. That meant Yvonne knew him during the uncertain years, when he was still experimenting with music and theater and trying to understand what he wanted from life. Then, everything changed. Acting opportunities began appearing. Murphy started traveling for work. His name slowly became familiar to audiences outside Ireland. Eventually, directors who would become major figures in his career began paying attention to him. Through all of that, the relationship didn't suddenly become a public spectacle. That may sound ordinary, but in an industry where relationships can become part of a celebrity's brand, their approach was remarkably different. Yvonne continued pursuing her own artistic work, rather than becoming a permanent fixture beside Murphy at every public event. Murphy, meanwhile, rarely treated his personal life as something audiences were entitled to know. That boundary became increasingly valuable as his career grew. The public could know his characters. They could analyze his performances. They could debate his movies. But the man waiting at home remained largely separate, and that separation would become even more important once marriage and children entered the picture. By the time Murphy and Yvonne married in 2004, his career was already moving forward quickly. Yet their wedding wasn't treated like a celebrity event. They chose a private setting, connected to Yvonne's family in France, far away from the kind of publicity surrounding modern celebrity weddings. That choice established a pattern that would continue for years. Murphy didn't build his public identity around his marriage. Yvonne didn't constantly appear beside him to increase her own visibility. Instead, both seemed comfortable, maintaining separate identities while sharing a private life. Murphy's lack of social media has made that boundary even stronger. In an age when celebrities can reveal their homes, vacations, children, opinions, and relationships within seconds, he has largely refused to participate in that cycle. It doesn't mean he has disappeared completely. He gives interviews, promotes his work, and occasionally speaks warmly about his family. But there is a difference between acknowledging your personal life and turning it into content. Murphy has consistently chosen the former, and once children arrived, protecting that distinction became even more important. Murphy and Yvonne welcomed their first son, Malachy, in 2005, followed by their second son, Aaron, in 2007. The timing was significant because Murphy's career was becoming increasingly demanding. He was no longer simply the young actor from Cork trying to prove himself. He was taking on larger productions, working with increasingly famous directors, and spending more time away from home. Yet Fatherhood gave him something that the film industry couldn't provide: a reason to return to normal life. The contrast was striking. On a film set, Murphy could spend hours becoming someone completely different. At home, he wasn't Thomas Shelby or Oppenheimer. He was simply a father. That ordinary role appears to have been one of the strongest anchors in his life. It also meant his decisions weren't only about his own career anymore. Every new project could involve travel, long shoots, unfamiliar countries, and months of intense work. Family became part of the equation. Murphy has spoken about how valuable it was to have a secure home life while dealing with the stranger parts of fame. The more his career expanded, the more important that private world became. But eventually, there was another question the family had to answer. Where should that private life actually be? For years, London had been an important base for Murphy's career. It placed him closer to major productions and gave the family access to opportunities that would have been harder to find elsewhere. But success can create a strange problem. The life that once felt exciting can eventually start feeling disconnected from who you are. Murphy has described reaching a point where he questioned whether staying in London was really what he wanted for the rest of his life. There was comfort there, but comfort wasn't necessarily the same thing as belonging. Ireland remained deeply connected to his identity, and as his sons grew older, that connection became even more important. He wanted them to experience the environment that had shaped him, surrounded by extended family and Irish culture, rather than growing up completely removed from it. The decision wasn't about abandoning his career. By then, Murphy had already established himself internationally. It was about deciding what kind of life he wanted when the cameras weren't rolling. And that question eventually led the family toward a major move back to Ireland. A decision that would influence not only where his children grew up, but also how Murphy himself handled the strange reality of becoming famous. In 2015, Murphy and his family made a decision that said more about their priorities than any interview ever could. They left London and returned to Dublin, settling in Monkstown. By then, Murphy's career was firmly established, and staying in London would have been the obvious choice. It was closer to the industry's center, and offered plenty of professional advantages. But for Murphy, there was something more important than convenience. He wanted his sons to grow up around their extended family and remain connected to the culture that had shaped him. He has also spoken humorously about wanting his children to sound Irish rather than gradually adopting the polished English accents they were developing in London. The move gave the family something fame could never provide: familiarity. Cousins, grandparents, old friends, familiar places, and the feeling of actually belonging somewhere. For Murphy, Ireland wasn't simply the country where he happened to be born. It was part of the foundation of who he became. Returning home also meant stepping away from the celebrity bubble that could easily surround a successful actor. And that decision revealed something important about the man behind the fame. The public knows Cillian Murphy through fragments: a photograph on a red carpet, a movie premiere, an interview about a new role, maybe an acceptance speech after another major award. But those moments represent only a tiny part of his actual life. Away from cameras, Murphy has repeatedly described home as something far more ordinary and grounding. That's especially important for an actor who spends months constructing intense personalities. Playing Thomas Shelby required him to inhabit violence, trauma, ambition, and emotional isolation. Playing J. Robert Oppenheimer meant carrying the psychological weight of a man who helped change history. Those characters could easily dominate an actor's identity if there were no place to escape them. Murphy appears to have created that escape at home. Family provides a world where he doesn't have to perform. There is no audience waiting for a dramatic line, no director asking him to become someone else, no expectation that he should be mysterious or intimidating. He's simply Cillian, husband and father. That normality may be one of the reasons he has managed to survive such an unusual career without allowing fame to completely reshape his personality. But keeping that normal life intact has required one very deliberate choice. Murphy's approach to fame is almost the opposite of what the entertainment industry usually rewards. Celebrity culture thrives on visibility. The more people know about you, the more attention you can generate. Murphy has consistently gone in the other direction. He rarely gives the public access to his family, doesn't maintain the kind of social media presence that keeps celebrities permanently visible, and generally avoids turning ordinary moments into publicity. That doesn't mean he dislikes his career. Quite the opposite. He clearly loves acting and continues taking ambitious roles. The distinction is that he seems interested in the work, rather than the celebrity identity attached to it. He has even expressed discomfort with being described as a movie star, suggesting that the label is something other people place on him rather than something he personally seeks. That attitude becomes especially interesting when you consider how famous he has become. After Peaky Blinders and Oppenheimer, Murphy could easily have embraced the attention. Instead, he continued protecting the same private world he had built long before the awards arrived. And nowhere is that contrast clearer than in the way his own family views his career. Imagine winning an Academy Award, becoming one of the most recognizable actors in the world, and then coming home to discover that your children aren't particularly impressed. That's essentially the reality Murphy has described. His sons have grown up knowing that their father is famous, but fame doesn't necessarily make a person fascinating to teenagers. To them, he's still their dad. His movies can be intense, strange, or even impressive, but that doesn't automatically make him a larger-than-life figure at home. In fact, Murphy has joked about how his sons don't necessarily sit around having special family movie nights featuring everything he's made. Their reactions can be much more blunt. They've seen enough of his work to understand that their father has a habit of choosing extremely serious characters, but they don't appear to treat his filmography like a museum. That ordinary family perspective can be incredibly grounding for someone surrounded by constant professional praise. Critics can call him brilliant. Directors can describe his extraordinary talent. Millions of people can celebrate his performances. At home, however, the expectations are much simpler. Be present, be yourself, and don't take yourself too seriously. That humility became one of the defining qualities of his career. Everything changed when Murphy became Thomas Shelby. Before Peaky Blinders, he was already respected, particularly among filmmakers and audiences who recognized his ability to disappear into difficult roles. But Tommy Shelby transformed that recognition into something much bigger. Suddenly, audiences around the world were fascinated by a character who barely needed to raise his voice to control a room. Shelby's power came from restraint, the slow stare, the measured words, the silence before a decision. Murphy understood that the character couldn't simply be played as a stereotypical gangster. Tommy needed history behind his eyes. He needed to feel like a man who had survived experiences that permanently changed him. That emotional complexity became the secret of the performance. Viewers weren't simply watching a gangster become powerful. They were watching a damaged man trying to control everything around him because he couldn't control what had already happened inside his own mind. Murphy's performance turned Shelby into one of television's most recognizable characters. And the more famous Tommy became, the stranger the contrast with Murphy's real personality became. One was becoming an international symbol of danger. The other was still quietly protecting the life waiting for him when the cameras stopped rolling. Thomas Shelby wasn't powerful because he constantly shouted or threatened people. His danger came from everything he refused to say. Murphy understood that immediately. Beneath the tailored suits and controlled voice was a man shaped by war, loss, and experiences he could never simply leave behind. Instead of explaining Tommy's pain through endless dialogue, Murphy often let silence do the work. A glance could reveal more than a page of conversation. A pause could suggest memories Tommy desperately wanted to bury. That restraint became one of the most recognizable parts of the performance. Murphy didn't try to make Shelby lovable. He made him understandable. Viewers could see why people followed him, while also recognizing how destructive his choices could become. That balance kept the character fascinating for years. It also demonstrated something Murphy had been developing since his theater days: the ability to communicate without making everything obvious. The darker Tommy became, the quieter Murphy often played him. And that approach helped turn a gangster character into something much more complicated. But behind the scenes, the role demanded something else from Murphy: the willingness to return to the same psychological world again and again. Most actors eventually say goodbye to a character. A film ends, the production wraps, and they move on to something completely different. Murphy had a very different experience with Thomas Shelby. He returned to the character across multiple seasons, allowing Tommy to evolve in ways a 2-hour movie rarely permits. Every new chapter revealed another layer. His ambitions changed, his relationships fractured, his victories became less satisfying, and the consequences of his past kept following him. For Murphy, that long relationship with one character became a rare creative opportunity. He could remember tiny details from earlier performances and carry them forward. A look that meant one thing in the first season could mean something completely different years later. That continuity helped make Tommy feel like a real person rather than a collection of dramatic moments. Fans became deeply attached to the character, and eventually the question wasn't whether Tommy's story was finished, but whether Murphy would ever return to him. Years after the original series ended, that question finally received an answer. But before getting there, it's worth understanding the acting technique that made Murphy's performances so distinctive in the first place. There are actors who can dominate a scene by speaking louder than everyone else. Murphy often does the opposite. His greatest weapon may be his ability to remain completely still while making an audience feel that something enormous is happening underneath the surface. His eyes became especially important. They can look vulnerable in one moment and almost frightening in the next. That ability became crucial for Tommy Shelby. But it wasn't limited to Peaky Blinders. Murphy has repeatedly used tiny physical changes to transform himself. A different posture, a changed rhythm of speech, a new accent, a subtle shift in where he focuses his attention. None of these techniques are flashy on their own. Together, they create the feeling that the actor has disappeared and someone else has taken his place. That's why Murphy could move from a gangster to a scientist to a comic book villain without audiences feeling like they were simply watching the same person wearing different clothes. He also developed an extraordinary ability with accents and voices, adapting himself to completely different environments. But eventually, Christopher Nolan gave him a character that demanded more than physical transformation. It demanded almost complete psychological immersion. Murphy's relationship with Christopher Nolan began years before Oppenheimer. In Batman Begins, he originally auditioned for Bruce Wayne, before Nolan ultimately cast him as Dr. Jonathan Crane, better known as Scarecrow. It turned out to be a perfect example of Murphy's willingness to embrace unexpected opportunities. Crane wasn't physically imposing, like some comic book villains. His danger came from intelligence and fear. Murphy played him with an unsettling calmness that made the character more disturbing precisely because he didn't behave like a traditional villain. Nolan noticed the potential, and their professional relationship continued through films including The Dark Knight and Inception. By the time Oppenheimer arrived, the two had already worked together repeatedly. Nolan trusted Murphy with a role that required enormous commitment. J. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't a conventional hero or villain. He was a brilliant scientist, caught between ambition, responsibility, politics, and the consequences of his own creation. Murphy approached the character with the same restraint that had defined his best work. But this time, the transformation would become physical as well as psychological. Playing Oppenheimer required Murphy to make the character feel physically fragile while still communicating an enormous intellect. He lost a significant amount of weight for the role, creating the gaunt appearance Nolan wanted. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. Murphy spent months immersing himself in Oppenheimer's world, studying the scientist's lectures, writings, interviews, and historical record. The goal wasn't simply to memorize facts. It was to understand how Oppenheimer thought, how he spoke, and how someone could appear brilliant and confident while carrying an increasingly complicated sense of responsibility. Murphy has described preparation as important, but he also believes an actor can't control every second of a performance. Too much planning can make a scene feel mechanical. Instead, he tries to leave room for instinct. That philosophy became especially powerful in Oppenheimer, where so much of the story depended on tiny changes in expression rather than obvious emotional speeches. The result was a performance that finally brought Murphy the industry's biggest individual recognition. But when that moment arrived, the first people on his mind weren't Hollywood executives or fellow actors. They were waiting for him at home. In March 2024, Murphy finally stood on the Academy Awards stage as a Best Actor winner for Oppenheimer. After years of intense roles and near misses, the moment had arrived. But his attention quickly turned away from himself. He thanked Yvonne and their sons, making the achievement feel deeply personal. For someone who had spent decades protecting his private life, it was a rare glimpse behind the curtain. But the biggest chapter wasn't over yet. Murphy's Oscar speech became memorable for another reason. He openly acknowledged Yvonne as his partner in life and art. It was a remarkably personal moment, from an actor who rarely discusses his marriage publicly. The words were brief, but they revealed how important that partnership had been throughout his career. Behind the biggest award of his life stood the same person who knew him before the fame began. And then came another unexpected chapter. After years away from Tommy Shelby, Murphy returned for Peaky Blinders, The Immortal Man, in 2026. The character had become one of the defining roles of his career, and fans were eager to see what remained of Tommy's story. The film brought the Shelby world into a new era and gave Murphy another chance to inhabit the character who changed everything. But the real question was whether Tommy had truly escaped his past. Tommy Shelby spends his life running from trauma, while Murphy has built his real life around stability. One man is consumed by power and danger. The other protects family, privacy, and ordinary moments. That contrast may explain why Murphy can disappear so completely into Tommy without becoming him. When the cameras stop, the character disappears. What remains is the private life he carefully protected for decades. And that's the part fame never managed to take away. Murphy's greatest achievement may not be Tommy Shelby or even his Oscar. It may be maintaining the same grounded identity after becoming internationally famous. From a young musician in Cork to one of Hollywood's most respected actors, his priorities remain surprisingly consistent. Yvonne, his family, Ireland, and his privacy stayed outside the machinery of celebrity. He became famous without allowing fame to become his entire identity. And perhaps that's the most unexpected ending of all.